During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Robert F. Kennedy and his team of diplomats had a huge influence in diffusing the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union before the crisis could escalate into nuclear Armageddon.
Although it looked bleak, the diplomats were able to make a deal for the U.S. to remove their warheads and missiles from Turkey, and the Soviets would follow by removing their missiles and warheads from Cuba.
The deal made in the spring of 1963 between the two great superpowers was kept secret from the public to give the impression that the United States had emerged victorious in driving off the Soviet Union from the Western Hemisphere. If this solution had not been created, humanity would have faced its end, as the United States was planning to invade Cuba the day after both countries had pulled their missiles out of Cuba and Turkey respectively. So let's travel back to 1961 to see how the events unfolded, and it all began inside of the Kremlin.
In 1961, the Allied forces known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, were building missile silos all over Western Asia and Europe. As more and more were constructed, the Russian Premier, Nikita Khrushchev, began to fear being totally encircled by enemy missile silos and wanted one specific project to end. That project was the Turkish project. However, in an effort to preserve the U.S.-Turkish relations, the U.S. decided not to remove the missiles or the silos from Turkish grounds.
In 1959, Fidel Castro and his communist rebels overthrew the Cuban government and installed a communist regime with him as dictator. The United States was horrified because they did not want a communist nation right across the Gulf of Mexico. So 2 years later, President John F. Kennedy attempted to invade Cuba through the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Not only was the invasion a humiliating failure because of the lack of effort put in by the United States to secure a foothold in Cuba, it also alarmed the Soviet Union and Khrushchev especially of the goal of the United States to contain communism.
Khrushchev grew increasingly concerned as Jupiter missiles were being built and loaded into silos in Turkey. So, in 1962, they decided to put the same pressure on the US as they were being put under. They decided they would secretly begin to install silos and missiles in Cuba, so that Washington, D.C. was in range of their missiles, just as Moscow was in range of the missiles placed by NATO.
It would be a day like any other during the Cold War. Anti-communist propaganda would become regular during this time, and the civilians would enjoy life in a divided world between two completely opposite ideologies. Just a few days earlier, spy planes had flown over Cuba, as per protocol ever since the communist insurrection in 1959. What these spy planes captured photos of was incredibly alarming to many Americans. The photos that were sent back from the spy planes were pictures of Soviet SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles that were being assembled along the coast of Cuba. The silos, or launch points, were strategically placed to be in range of Washington, D.C., and many other densely populated cities in the United States, such as New York, Baltimore, and Philadelphia.
The government was in shock, as many of the largest population centers of the country were completely exposed to the possible barrage of nuclear hell. Kennedy and his advisors met in a state of panic to formulate multiple solutions for preventing the Soviets from importing their missiles into Cuba.
ExComm, the advisory branch of the executive branch who assisted the president, met to quickly discuss possible solutions to the conflict. The three solutions were an all-out invasion of Cuba, a blockade to prevent the Soviets from importing the missiles or airstrikes on the missile bases. The cabinet chose the blockade, so the United States began to intercept Soviet naval vessels entering into Cuban waters. Consequently, this only escalated the crisis as the Soviets, and especially Khrushchev, saw the blockade as an act of aggression, or in other words, an act of war.
The Soviet Union was outraged by this sudden act of aggression and put their entire military on standby for possible war, which means the Air Force could be ready to deploy at any minute, and the rest of the military forces would be ready to deploy in any day. The United States would put their military on DEFCON 3. The world began to prepare for nuclear war. Kennedy made an emergency broadcast to the United States detailing the locations of the missile silos and the capabilities of the ballistic missile station inside of Cuba by the Soviet Union. He warned that if any missile was launched at any nation in the Western Hemisphere, it would be regarded as an attack directly at the United States by the Soviet Union.
The United States placed Strategic Air Command on DEFCON 2, and SAC had control over the nuclear warheads and the ballistic missiles. If the United States reached DEFCON 1, it would mean all-out nuclear war with the Soviet Union, and in the process, most likely destroy humanity. Communications between both sides would break down as tensions began to get larger by the day. To the world, the clock was only ticking closer to the end of everything.
However, on October 27th, Khrushchev sent a message to President Kennedy detailing that if the United States promised to never invade Cuba, then the Soviet Union would remove their missiles from the island. Later that day, however, Khrushchev sent another letter demanding the removal of the missiles in Turkey and other bases in Europe for the removal of the missiles in Cuba. This would only be made worse, however, after a United States U-2 reconnaissance plane was shot down over Cuba. Kennedy was furious, and he began to drop the plan to invade Cuba.
Knowing full well that if he invaded Cuba, it would mean all-out war with the Soviets, he sent the Attorney General and his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, to attempt to diplomatically solve the crisis with the Soviet ambassador to Washington, D.C., Anatoly Dobrynin. After complicated diplomacy, they concluded that the United States was planning to remove the missiles and silos from Turkey within 6 months, so there would be no reason to keep the missiles in Cuba either.
This solution was massive and was one of only 2 events during the time of DEFCON 2 that was an active attempt to create a solution rather than continue to increase tensions. The tragedy of this event is that it was kept completely secret from the public and was only released over 20 years after this historic event occurred. The next day would begin a new era of diplomacy, not just for the United States, but for the world. In October of 1962, Khrushchev came forward with a way out. The Soviet Union will take their missiles and disassemble those silos that are placed in Cuba for exchange of the U.S. missiles to be removed from Turkey. The public was outraged at him for negotiating with the enemy, but Khrushchev held strong in his beliefs in conflict resolution, which he had been attempting to do for the entirety of the crisis. Only 2 years later, Khrushchev was removed from power, somewhat due to his response to the Cuban Missile Crisis.
For President Kennedy, the peace would not last forever. On November 22nd of 1963, Kennedy was assassinated while traveling in Dallas, Texas, by a sniper from a rooftop. The nation mourned his death with great sadness, and they honored his legacy by working towards peace with the Soviet Union instead of annihilation. Soon enough, Robert F. Kennedy was also assassinated on June 6th of 1968, when suffering around 6 to 8 gunshot wounds from point-blank range. The Cuban Missile Crisis was, without a doubt, the closest the U.S. has ever come to a full-blown nuclear war. It showed how adversaries can make compromises even when all hope seems to be lost. The crisis paved the way for the creation of many nuclear test ban treaties and deals to limit nuclear weapons. The world would never reach this level of tension again because now the world knew the risks that they took on those 13 days.
The impact of the crisis cannot be understated. However, Kennedy kept the compromise between the Soviet Union and the United States secret, which undermines the diplomacy that those men had to endure to find a solution what seemed like a hopeless situation. If the deal between Kennedy and Dobrynin had not been created, the world would be a very different and horrifying place.